What's up, everyone? It's Dan back with another Moonshine talking. And for this one, I figured I'd do something a little bit different, a little bit out of the ballpark of what I normally do as far as talking music, wrestling, movies, stuff like that. Um, so, as you can see, I have all sorts of weight training equipment in here with me. And I figured, you know what? I've never actually talked about any sort of weight training or anything like that. So, I said, what the hell? I'm constantly sitting here in a room that I'm showing off all sorts of weight training equipment, and I've never once discussed any of it or anything about weight training. So I said, let's do that. It'd be kind of fun. So, how I got into weight training, I honestly, I feel like my whole life I've been doing something physical, lifting things and putting them down and stuff like that. When I was a kid, growing up in upstate New York, winters are cold as all get out. So you always had to, my dad always had us stacking firewood, lifting it, not so much cutting it, but doing stuff like that. We were always doing some sort of manual labor at home. Me and my brother, well, more me, but he would supervise, and I do all the work. But no, we'd always do stuff like that, always lifting stuff. But I always had a fascination with bodybuilding ever since I was a little kid. A lot of it is because of watching pro wrestling, being into pro wrestling, uh, watching the movie Conan the Barbarian. I'm sure you probably have a thousand if you have one person who were influenced or who were motivated to get into weightlifting and bodybuilding, fitness, wellness, that sort of thing, just being into this sort of lifestyle. I would imagine a lot of people my age and probably a little bit older, a lot of it dates back to the 80s and watching, and even late 70s, and seeing Pumping Iron, seeing Conan the Barbarian, probably a lot of the Rambo movies, all the other stuff Schwarzenegger did, Predator, Commando, all that sort of stuff, Rocky, growing up watching that sort of stuff, there was always an emphasis on a certain look, a certain aesthetic back then, especially. That was really when the weight training and aerobic boom started hitting in a lot of different places, but particularly here in the states. So it was a very influential period in time, and a lot of that stuff was very influential on me wanting to look like that when as I got older, as I grew into my body. Being a scrawny little kid, I was probably, I would say, probably seventh grade. I was wrestling at 112 pounds. So, kind of get an idea, like right now, I currently, at this moment, I weigh 190. So, kind of picture me with 78 less pounds on my physique, and you kind of get an idea of what I looked like. I was pretty much just skin and bone at that point. Still hadn't sprouted quite as tall as I ended up getting. I'm about 6 foot, give or take. I always joke that when I broke my back wrestling, I probably lost a half an inch. And then when they had to fuse my neck, I probably gained that and maybe a little bit more. But yeah, that's really how I got into it. Schwarzenegger, the Road Warriors, Ultimate Warrior, a lot of the guys who were really in really good shape in pro wrestling. Ricky Steamboat, Paul Orndorff. These were all guys that were in fantastic shape. On top of being good wrestlers, that was kind of Dynamite Kid and the British Bulldog. Those are kind of like the people who kind of got me into this sort of lifestyle. So I would always every once in a while, and my cousin Kevin, I can't leave him out. He was into it because he played sports and he had weights always in his room. So whenever I'd go hang out at my aunt and uncle's house, and if he was around or he wasn't around or he was out, my brother and him are pretty good friends. So they'd go out. They had like a connection playing baseball and all that. I like baseball, but I never really I didn't get into it probably as much as I should have because I wasn't half bad at it. I never really pursued it probably like I ought to have done back in the day. But coulda, shoulda, woulda. Those are nice words. So he'd have free weights laying around, and I would just pick them up and start doing curls and stuff like that. And that's kind of how I got started. And then I can't remember if it was him or if it was a family friend who had a weight training book that was done by Franco Colombo, which was Schwarzenegger's one of his really good friends, bodybuilding contemporaries. And that I would read that and I would start doing it. And a family friend of ours, he gave me a really crappy weight set, all rusted out and ancient as all as could be. And I would just start working out. I would start following the manual, and it was very DIY when I first started, very, very raw and very probably unhealthy for me because I can always remember like when I first started, I didn't understand the concept of a squat rack because I'm basically a hillbilly from the mountains, and we didn't have those sorts of things growing up. So what I would do is I would take the weights and I would press them over my head, and then I would put them behind my neck and set them on my shoulders, and I would do squats that way, and I do what I could, and then I would press them back up and let them down, and half the time I'd drop them on the ground in my parents' basement, which led to a few holes in the ground. And me being the genius that I am, I never thought to just ask my dad to get some concrete and patch them up. I would just throw like old rags and crap in there to try and fill in the hole, and that never worked out as well as I'd planned. But yeah, that's kind of how I got started. And then as I got into sports and stuff like that, that's when getting into weight training and being more fitness savvy and health conscious, that's when it started getting more of it became more of an imperative. Like if you wanted to be into this sort of thing, to me, I always felt like you had to be in shape, whether it was football or wrestling, the little bit of track and field and baseball that I did for a very limited amount of time. I wasn't a big, I would go out for the teams and then I would leave because it wouldn't hold any interest for me. But football and wrestling were the main things, and weight training, those were always the three things that I always, athletically, that's always what I liked. I also like beach volleyball too, if you can believe that. I enjoy that sort of thing. I'm kind of a competitive person, and I enjoy sports. I really enjoy playing them more so than watching them, but I really enjoy the physically active part of sports. I'm just not a big sit down and watch sports and stats and stuff like that. That's honestly more of a, like my brother is really into that sort of thing, but I always loved playing them more than I did watching them. And yeah, just very competitive person. That's kind of stuck with me my entire life. You know, I don't like losing. I don't like failing. I don't like not meeting a goal or completing a mission or anything like that. So and a lot of that comes with being into the fitness lifestyle. And when I was a kid, I would get very depressed because my body hadn't quite started growing, or it wasn't quite ready to develop into the mass monster that I thought it ought to have been. So I'd get really depressed about that. And there were times where I would just sit there in a corner and kind of pout and feel bad for myself and just have a good sulk on about that. And probably my sister could tell you that better than anybody, how sad and depressed I would get about that. But it took time. And then eventually, when I got out of high school, in high school, I wrestled 145 my senior year. And then when I went into college, I was probably weighing about, probably about 160, something like that. I would say, give or take a few pounds. And when I was in college, that's really when I became motivated to get into the pro wrestling industry. Found a guy at the gym at the school, and we got talking. He gave me a manual that was made by Jim Cornette and Percy Pringle, Paul Bear, for those of you who don't know. And I read that, and it really motivated me to get into the gym, even though I was already in the gym pretty hardcore and working out a ton and starting to see results. That's really when I started to see results. I finally got to a point where I was eating enough calories, packing on enough weight, putting enough time in at the gym, and of course being young and full of testosterone. That always helps. But yeah, I finally I probably went from I would say probably what I did is I probably went from my 145 weight senior year in high school to which was 95, and then I went by the time probably like 96, maybe early 97, I was up to about 170, 175. So people were noticing the difference. They were like they actually thought I was on something, and which I wasn't. The only thing I took at the time was a thing called Ripped Fuel, which they used to sell GNCs and stuff like that, and it was basically like a pre-workout for its day, and it was great. I enjoyed it. It's funny because I'm not really into stimulants, but the stuff that I can't get enough of are the pre-workout stuff, and probably at times to my detriment, because nowadays a lot of it's probably just toxic ooze. But that said, salut, cheers. Get ready to work out in a bit here, so but I figured I would talk about this real quick. And yeah, I would just, and when you start seeing results, that's when you start getting even more consistent. You get more motivated to do it. And yeah, I got pretty jacked when I was a young man. And then I got into wrestling, and wrestling I stayed probably while training. I was as a student, I probably stayed in that 175, 180 pound range. My first year in the business, that's probably roughly what I was weighing. And then I started doing more research on supplements and trying to take, increase add supplements to my regimen because, of course creatine was one of the big crazes then, and started adding the protein powders and stuff like that, and trying to come up with stuff that would help as far as not going as far as steroids, because I never did steroids, in case anyone was ever wondering. I've never done steroids. Uh, it was probably the closest I've come is taking some stuff that was kind of on the bubble, if not probably dosed with a little bit of something or other. But beyond that, I never booted up anything. I never took any DECA or test or Tren or anything like that. I just never did. Maybe I would have gotten farther in the wrestling business had I packed on a few more pounds like that. Maybe like once upon a time, somebody suggested when WWE was going to start developing NXT down here, and they started with FCW, and that started at the training center that I was working out of. Somebody had suggested to me that if I were all of you guys speaking to a whole group of us, I would be getting on growth right now and packing on the sorts of size that they look for, because it is a cosmetic business. Aesthetics matter in pro wrestling industry, regardless of what maybe somebody may or may not tell you, but it does matter. It matters a lot. Again, it's a cosmetic business. You're on television. You ought to look the part. You're supposed to be a superhero come to life. So it matters that you look like a superhero. Like there's a reason John Cena's been on top forever. On top of he can talk his ass off, he gets people emotionally invested in his matches, but he also looks like $1 million. Even today, he's roughly my age and he looks like $1 million. But he takes very good care of himself. He's very well researched on what he puts into his body. He used to be a competitive bodybuilder, and he's very meticulous about how he does things. And a lot of guys are. A lot of guys at the top are. Not to get off on a pro wrestling tangent, but it does relate to this. And yeah, so I started getting a little bit more serious about my fitness goals and my bodybuilding choices and stuff like that. And at that point, I went from probably I kind of lost my mind a little bit when I was wrestling, so I took for me, unfortunately, I took 3 years off, almost three and a half, and which was a mistake, but that's another story. Um, but in that time, I went from being 175. I spent a lot of time dedicating myself in the gym, and I pushed myself up past the 200-pound mark, and I was probably at my heaviest. When I returned to the business, I was probably about 205, 210, and I think probably at my heaviest, I was never more than like 220, and for the most part, didn't carry a real high fat percentage. I mean, I've always had the little what we refer to as the distal gut, but other than that, that's pretty much all I really ever deal with. That's always been my biggest thing is not having abs. It's always been the bane of my existence is not having abs, which led me to I started this new diet where I wanted to try to eliminate a lot of sugar from my diet because I'm a junk food junkie. It's one of the I don't have a lot of vices in life, but one of the ones I do is junk food, and I love it. I love it a lot. I always have, but I've noticed that I consume a lot of it, and I don't want to get myself into a situation where it has an adverse health effect on my body. Uh, you never want to be a person that gets insulin resistant or develops pre-diabetes or diabetes or anything like that. It's not it's not the worst thing in the world that you could develop, but at the same time, it's like a lot of things. If you can avoid them, then avoid it at all costs. It's better to not have to deal with it than to have to deal with it. I'm sure people who manage it well, they'll tell you, well, I do okay. But at the same time, if you were to really ask them to genuinely, would you prefer to not do this or not have this? Then they would go, yeah. So I just noticed I've been consuming a lot of sugar, so I really pretty much all but cut all sugar out of my diet for the most part, other than I have my drink with the lemon and the parsley, and I'll throw honey in there, but I cut it back in half because I noticed that even honey has a lot of added sugars in there. So I cut that in half, and that's pretty much all the sugar that I consume in a day. Switched out some of my fruits. I like bananas, but I cut back on those because they're pretty high in sugar. Switched them up for avocados and grapefruits and raspberries and all different types of berries as opposed to bananas and stuff like that. Started eating grapefruit, which is helpful. And I don't exactly know what I weighed when I started on this diet about a month ago, but I'm down to, as of yesterday, I'm down to about 190.6 is what they told me. I actually weighed 192.6, but I asked them how much should I subtract for clothes and wallet and keys and all that. They said probably, and shoes, and they said probably about 2 pounds. So I weigh about 190, which is I want to get down to 185, but I also told myself if I got to 190, then I felt like I had accomplished something. So it's just about there. And then I'm going to go sweat some more. So I'll probably be down there and then take a healthy BM and I'll probably definitely be down there. But yeah, and as far as just my philosophy on working out, the technical aspects of it, when I was younger, it was always high weight, low reps. Always trying to keep your form correct. I always used to. I never fully understood when they would tell you to contract your abdominal muscles. Now I understand it a lot more. You basically, the best way I can describe to people is to visualize your belly button being a magnet and your spine being a piece of metal, or vice versa. And you basically want to have the two connect to each other. You want to press your abs back and your belly button as tightly back, trying to press it as far back to your spine as humanly possible without injuring yourself. And that's the best way to keep your abs tight when you're doing workouts. Through having my shoulder injuries, I've learned different tips and techniques on how to properly position shoulders. Like you want to keep them down as opposed to slumped up. You don't want to do that as much. You want to kind of keep them down and have your scapular shoulder blades down, and keep your chest up a little bit, but not to the point where you're arching your lower back, because then that'll cause injuries. uh try to try to keep your head pretty, try to keep it static, and that you can generally doing a lot of that stuff, you'll avoid a lot of neck injuries and shoulder injuries. Right now I have a bone spur that presses on my AC joint. So trying to avoid surgery as much as possible has been the goal. So that's why they taught me a lot of that stuff. Going and having lower back injuries from improperly working out, doing too heavy a weight with poor form. It taught me a bunch of the core stuff that I've learned over the years. Of course, going and having ACDF surgery caused me to have to rethink how I did do my weight training. There's a lot of stuff I can't do anymore. I can't do squats. I can't do barbell squats. I can't put a lot of heavy weight against the back of my neck. Um, I also have, it's referred to as stenosis, which is basically a narrowing of the spinal column. It's a degenerative thing. A lot of it, I think, comes from all the years of contact sports and, of course, the wrestling, taking one too many bumps once too often and at bad angles. So I have to be wary of that because I got a couple of disc issues that I have to work around and try to not exacerbate to the point where I wind up back on an operating table. And so what I really I try to tell people that sometimes it's not so much about the weight, it's about the work. You can be it, you see guys and they're out there they're throwing up ridiculous weights and ridiculous numbers. That's all fine and good and I love seeing that too, but at the same time, it's not about that. It's about putting in maximum effort and getting the most bang for your buck when you're working out. You know, going to failure is your best option and keeping a proper form, particularly with, like I say, doing the shoulders and the abs, keeping your abs tight, keeping your shoulders back and down when you're working out. Those are as far as a few tips I could offer for somebody. But beyond that, it's not about how what's the heaviest weight you can press up in that doesn't so much matter, because there's people that if you went into a gym and you were there with some young kid who's just starting out or an older person, somebody in their 60s, 70s or 80s who has tons of joint problems or arthritis or anything like that, you're not going to be some douchebag meathead who goes into the gym and like pushes them off the bench because they can't they're not doing incline presses with 70, 80 pound dumbbells and just throwing them up and launching them. That's kind of that's just douchebag behavior. And but then I saw a video of this that dude Joey Swole. He had one that he put up that I thought was kind of interesting and it made a lot of sense where there's people that just don't have, they're everybody's got their story why they're into fitness, why they're into weightlifting and weight training. And some people they're there for either it helps keep their mind straight. They maybe they can't do a lot of weight because they have a heart condition. This one's doing it because like he said, one just lost a loved one, and this is the only thing he knows to do or she knows to do to cope with the loss. And so everybody's got a story. Everybody's got a reason. You don't have to go in there. And I mostly work out at home because I don't really like. I should go to the gym, but I don't. I used to go to a gym and it was full of just douchebag people and I just didn't like being around a lot of them. So I ended up I built my own and do it all at home. It doesn't help for social interaction, which I do think is a crucial part of going to the gym. It's good to be around like-minded individuals and get to know people and try to build up relationships that way. That's definitely something I've neglected over the years, but it's good to be here and just do my thing, listen to my own music, not have to deal with a bunch of douchebags. The worst part is you don't get to see a bunch of hot scattered ass walking around. So that's kind of sucks. I do enjoy. I would buy a beer for the guy who invented yoga pants because that person is a genius on so many levels. And some of the women that walk around nowadays and are into fitness, they're just ridiculously attractive. It's almost a crime. But anyhow, so yeah, without babbling on too much longer, let me know what you think. If I just figured this would be kind of an interesting thing to do and tell people about. You know, you see me all the time on these videos sitting in front of a bunch of weights. So I figured I'd talk about them for a little bit. So anyhow, that's what I got for you. Hope you enjoyed it. This is Dan from Moonshine Talking. Uh, yeah, it's getting really black outside, so I should probably turn this off. All right, everyone, take it easy. I'll catch you on the next video. Later.